And so California might not just provide an example of what kind of tool might exist, but also how it might be used to influence policymaking at the state level. So why then, if there are these existing tools out there, do we decide we need to build our own? First is we wanted to be able to utilize the best local data. Obviously, CalEnviroScreen is not using Maryland data. And as for the EPA tool, they're very limited by their national scope. So they're only able to use data that's available at the block group level at a national scale, which means that they weren't able to look into all the data points that we were able to. The second one is that we wanted to be able to customize the tool to local community concerns. Environmental justice is obviously something that means something different in different parts of the country. To give an example, in California, the primary environmental justice concern in agricultural areas is pesticide use. While this is still relevant to the rural areas of Maryland, we might be perhaps more concerned with the pollutants coming from animal feeding facilities. So we wanted to be able to speak with local communities and customize the tool to their concerns. Finally, we wanted to make the tool potentially adaptable for state policymaking. So if that second concern deals with how do we make the tool relevant to communities, this final one is about how do we make the tool relevant to policymakers and decision makers, and how do we embed environmental justice in how decisions are made in the state. So, one of the things that was told to us by Dr. Wilson and Dr. Payne Sturgis is let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's lean heavily on the best efforts that are already out there. So what you're seeing right here is the approach that was used by CalEnviroScreen to develop their environmental justice score, and the approach that we unapologetically cribbed because, the California Health Department has spent immense resources and has many people working on this. So we thought that the best starting place for our tool would be to look at what CalEnviroScreen has already done. So to develop our eventual score, we used the same formula they used in CalEnviroScreen that takes kind of the average of all of our pollution burden layers, as well as all the average of the population characteristics layers, and multiplied them together. And I'll be getting into what these layers are in a moment. But essentially, these two broad categories are really important and really what makes this tool about environmental justice and not merely about pollution concerns. So we have the pollution burden on one side that helps us determine what areas have the highest level of exposure in their communities. And then finally, on the other side, we have population characteristics that help us to determine what communities we might be concerned about receiving a disproportionate exposure. So multiplying these two broad categories together gets us a final score that gives us, a quick glance of what areas might be of environmental justice concern in the state of Maryland. So next I'm going to go through the four kind of subcategories that go into our model. So the first category is under pollution burden. We call this exposure. We can think of exposure as pollution that is in the environment at all times and cannot be avoided. Simply by being in a place, you will be exposed to these conditions. So they include things like particulate matter, or ozone pollution, or traffic proximity and volume, which has a variety of associated health effects. The next two columns, you can see kind of what tools the two tools we looked at and how our tool overlaps with them. You can also see our source of the data, which varies from layer to layer, and then finally our geography. So one of the layers we were unable to include that we would have liked was that pesticide use data that California had, but unfortunately in the state of Maryland, we don't have geographically specific pesticide use data. We do have geographically specific data on where animal feeding locations are, so we're considering including that in a future version of the tool. The second broad category is what we call environmental effects. Unlike the exposure layer, these are pollutants that are kind of latent in the environment. They're things that you may not get exposed to, but under certain conditions, exposure may occur. I like to take the first as an example. So if we think about lead paint indicator, lead paint, even if you live in a house with it, may not be a problem so long as you're not exposed to it. But in a single day or a single event, lead paint can become an immediate problem. So all of these things, such as lead paint or proximity to polluting sites, you might be able to avoid if you behave carefully, but a single event or a single exposure always poses a great risk. So we want to also be aware of proximity to these sites. So moving to the population characteristic side, we have two sets of layers here. The first is sensitive populations. These are population groups that we would know to be at greater risk due to health conditions of exposure and of health effects due to exposure. So this includes asthma, it includes heart disease, as well as low birth weight infants. This is all data that we picked up at the zip code level and had to do some geospatial calculation in order to bring down to the census tract level where we're normally operating. Finally, we have the socioeconomic characteristics. These are kind of the layers that very much make this an environmental justice tool. It helps to identify populations that might be at greater risk due to social stressors and economic stressors. It includes percent low income, individuals of very high or very low age, as well as race and linguistic isolation. And I'm going to stop here for a second because I see a question already. Can you explain MDE watershed failure info? That I believe is a typo back there. The geography for watershed failure should say census tract. The source is the Maryland Department of the Environment. Watershed failure is any watershed that does not meet the targets for either nitrogen or phosphorus. So that's what's going into that. So moving on, if there's no more questions about the layers that go in, and I'll certainly be able to answer more about that later on. But one of the important notes is that each of the layers is scored in percentile terms. So when we get the score for each of the layer, we then rank them all from 0 to 100, and then according to that is your EJ score, your overall EJ score, or the score for any of the particular layers. Our tool helps people see their overall environmental justice score, as well as their score for any of the categories, and finally their score for any of the layers. So in that way, we're helping individuals as they use our tool to see what's going on, not just kind of at the composite level, but get an understanding of why their community might score the way that it does. Help communities to understand their story and tell their story. So that is it for explaining the tool that goes into it. Right now we're working with 3 different versions of the tool. Due to technical limitations with ArcGIS Online, we were unable to render the whole state at this moment. We're looking to expand the tool, get it onto a platform that is able to do that. But for the moment, we have 3 different tools that focus on kind of different either geographies or areas of concern. So we have one tool that focuses on Prince George's County and the area around that. And that tool has been really worked on a lot with community members. We have a second tool that is for Baltimore City and surroundings. We've presented that tool to Baltimore City Planning as well as other members of the city government there and gotten some feedback. And then finally, still very much in progress, we have a tool that maps these scores to legislative districts. One of the feedbacks that we've always gotten is that we need to be able to talk about what the results that this tool is showing at a level that is relevant for policymakers. And most community members, they can't tell you what census block or census tract they're in. So even though that's a really good way to visualize what's going on, it's not a really great way to kind of catch their attention and have them promote their own interests. Legislative districts, on the other hand, most people have some idea, of what legislative district they're in, and then, once you can tell them what their legislative district score is, then they can go to their legislators and make their case and explain what issues are important to them. So I'm going to focus today on probably the Prince George's County tool as well as a little bit of a demonstration of the other 2. So give me a moment as I switch around the presentation and bring up the tool. So I just received a question about tap water quality in the tool. So we did not include tap water quality. It was not included in any of the tools that we were looking at when we were building this. So frankly, it was not something that had come across our path, but I think it's a really good idea, particularly considering the events of the last couple of years. What I would say is we'd love to see a great data set for that so that we could include it in future versions of the tool, because I'm not at the moment aware of the best data set for that, though I'm sure that the people on this call are very much aware. Thank you for that question. So what we're looking at right now is our Prince George's County tool. As I mentioned, we weren't able to render the entire state at a census tract level, so instead we decided to develop more geographically focused tools. So you can see that we included Prince George's County as well as some surrounding jurisdictions. So I like to think of going into this tool as a community member might. So if I'm from Bladensburg, I'm probably going to start by searching for my community's location. And I might zoom in a little far, and I'll back out. And what I can immediately see, and now I'm going to check the legend here just to be sure, is that my location's environmental justice score is in that top 10 percentile. In the case of these scores, the higher the percentile, the greater the environmental justice concern of that community would be. So in our scaling, we've actually highlighted the top 10 percentile, the 75th to 90th, and then the 50th to 75th to kind of bump up those higher ranges help to determine the hot spots in the region. So if I click on Bladensburg, I immediately get a full set of scores for that community. And I can see from the top here that the census tract scores at 99th percentile. So, alarm bells should be going off. I'm thinking, all right, this is a very high scoring census tract. Why is it that it might be scoring this high? And I can quickly look through and see many of the indicators that went into this tool. So I can see that it's scoring very high on many of these exposure layers, the air toxic cancer risk or respiratory hazard index. I can also see that many of the social and demographic indicators are high: unemployment, exposure, environmental exposure, and percent non-white, for instance. So I can start to get an idea for why a community may or may not be scoring the way that it scores. One thing I will say about the Prince George's County tool that we don't have in the other versions of the tool is that we have two different scoring systems. This scoring system that we're looking at right now scales the overall EJ scores to our region of interest at the moment. So those percentiles are based on this zone that we're seeing that's been highlighted. We can also look at, if we turn this off, we can look at what the scores would be statewide. And you'll notice that a lot of the areas statewide score a little bit lower than they do on the regional scale. The reason that we created two different versions of the scoring is because the scoring, different decision makers in different communities might be thinking at different scales. If you're a statewide legislator, you might be really wanting to identify what are the hot spots at a state level. While if you're at Prince George's County level or a regional level, you might want to only think about what are the environmental justice hotspots within your region or your county. So we have those two different versions. And I'll return to that a little later, but for now, we'll continue to look at this statewide, the regional score that we developed for the Prince George's County version. So as I mentioned, we want community members to not only be able to look at their overall scores, but we want them to be able to explore what goes into that. And, I have already shown that you can click on a census tract and get that drop-down menu. And that's really helpful, but sometimes these tables are a little bit much to look at. It's not as compelling as the map. So we've developed the capability for communities to look at those four major categories. So if we start with exposure here, the first thing I might want to do if I'm looking at this tool is I might want to ask, well, what is my community exposed to every day? What's in the air? What's all around me that might be presenting a risk to my community? So I can turn on that exposure layer, and I can start to see that the Bladensburg area is scoring very high. Many areas around the Beltway are scoring very high, unsurprisingly. There's industrial areas in those areas as well as kind of the highest traffic and associated pollutants are in those areas. But I might want to dig down a little bit further still, in which case I can look at the individual layers that went into our tool. So I can look at, air toxics, cancer risks. Or I can look at ozone, which has an entirely different pattern than many of the other pollutants. We can see that ozone is concentrated on the eastern part of the region close to the Chesapeake Bay. That's because ozone is one of those pollutants that doesn't necessarily concentrate where it's produced, but it various pollutants go in the air, combine, and move around, and so exposures aren't always in the area of production. So once I'm able to turn these layers on and off, that also gives me an additional capability. I can start to take multiple layers at a time and see how it is that they overlap. Where now I'm seeing that the darker areas are the areas of greatest overlap between the indicators that I've selected. When doing this overlapping, it's important not to think necessarily as this is an official scoring of those overlaps. It's more of just an approach for exploring how various layers of concern might overlap. So for instance, if I'm concerned with how air pollution is affecting my community, I might take a few of these air pollution layers, and I also might take some of those socioeconomic factors, such as percent low income and percent non-white, and I'm starting to kind of tell a story about what areas I might be concerned of based on these factors. Or I might care about children as well to add to that. So in this way, community members or decision makers can start to explore how different areas of the state score on different indicators. Some of the scoring might align with their understanding, and some of it might be more surprising and helpful, such as, that ozone layer. I think it's really interesting when you first look at it to realize that it's not in the same spot as many of the other many of the other kind of local air pollutants. So I'm going to turn back on that regional EJ score for the one final portion of this tool before I get to questions. And I hope that everyone's still with me, because I know that this is I've covered a lot on this tool. So the one last thing that we added are these additional context layers. One of the things we were hearing back from communities is that there are things that they feel are relevant to environmental justice and their understanding of it that are not necessarily something that we'd want to include as a separate layer, or something that went into influencing these scores but that they'd like point source data for. So I call it these context layers, and really pretty much anything positive or negative can go into one of these context layers, so long as communities believe that it's important for them to understand their environmental justice story. So the layers that we're seeing here were layers that were worked on with the Port County communities in Prince George's County. For instance, we can see point source water discharges around the state. So we can see a concentration of them in this area, or here, or up. Looks like the 95 corridor has a concentration as well. We also have major air pollution sources. There's also positive things that the community might want to be aware of, because they are elements that might mitigate their environmental justice situation, might be a positive. So we have things like the locations of supermarkets. So that is the basics of the tool. I'm getting a question from Jamie Baxter asking, is the tool focused statewide in Maryland or only Central Maryland? That is a great question. So this edition of the tool is focused on the Central Maryland area, but we do have a separate version of the tool focused on the Baltimore area that we can see up here. One of the reasons that we felt that it was important to develop these two separate tools is that the Baltimore area scores really distort the scores at the statewide level. A lot of Baltimore communities have a combination of environmental pollutants as well as socioeconomic hardship that cause those communities throughout Baltimore to score much higher than communities elsewhere in the state. So we still wanted the tool to be relevant to concerns elsewhere, and thus we developed the Prince George's County and Environs tool so that people in the Prince George's area could have a better idea of the concerns in that area. And I'm hearing someone on the phone.
Hey folks, if you guys aren't speaking, can you please put your phone on mute? Thank you.
Thank you. So we do have these two separate versions of the tool. One of the things that we are looking to do that we don't yet have the support to accomplish is we want to bring the tool to the statewide level at a census tract level. We need a tiny bit of web developer support in order to do this. We do have, at our center, we do have in-house web development talent. We simply would need the support to kind of hire their time onto this project because we do think it's important to get the full statewide view of the environmental justice situation. But we do also think it's important to have these regional tools, such as the one we're looking at here, for kind of the Washington area and around it. Because as I mentioned before, different decision makers in different communities might be thinking at a different scale and want to address problems at a different scale. You know, just because a community doesn't score high on the statewide level doesn't mean that that community shouldn't be looking to address their environmental justice concerns within their own community. So a great example is if I go back to the statewide score for Maryland, you'll see that a lot fewer communities have high statewide scores in the Prince George's area, again because of the high scores in Baltimore. But we wouldn't want that. We wouldn't want, you know, communities in Maryland to think that they are off the hook, that they don't have areas that might be an environmental justice concern. So before I turn it entirely over, so I'm getting another question. Yes, so Jamie Baxter was asking about the separate tools again. Yes, they are separate because the poor scores in Baltimore do make everywhere else look better. So there's two reasons that it's separate. That is one of the reasons. The second reason, as I mentioned, is kind of the limitations of the platform, which we are looking to transcend. Before I completely turn it over to questions, I want to highlight one third tool that we're working on. As I mentioned, we're looking at legislative districts. This tool has not been entirely built out the way the other two tools have. So instead of having all the layers already embedded, we only have a limited subset. But I do think that this is valuable. So in this case, we have, right now we have a layer for the statewide score as well as those 4 broad categories. But we'll look at the statewide score for a moment. And again, we can see that when we're looking at statewide scores, a lot of the higher scores are concentrated in the Baltimore area. But now we're looking at legislative districts. So if I click on one of the districts, one of the geographies, I can now see that I'm looking at legislative district 40. So if I'm a resident in this district, I can now, you know, call up my representatives and make a case for environmental justice policies either, mitigating environmental concerns or investing in cleanup or other acts that would help to reduce environmental justice problems in my community. So this is a tool that's still in development, but we think it's really helpful. One thing that I will note is not to get too much in the weeds, but from a technical standpoint, the legislative districts are very strange geographies. They were not drawn to align well with census tracts, and thus when we're taking our scores from one level to from the census tract level up to this legislative district level, they are distorted to an extent. So even though I think that this is a helpful map to have, I would also argue that this particular map should be taken with an extra grain of salt, realizing that it's really difficult to get an accurate score up to the legislative district level. So thank you for listening. This was the environmental justice screening tool. 3 versions of it. We got Prince George's, Baltimore, and this legislative district version. And now I'll open up the floor to any questions for the next 20 minutes or so.
Thanks so much, Daniel. Does anybody on the phone have any questions, or you can also feel free to type them into the chat box too.
Hey Dan, it's Mariah. Can you remind us where we can find this tool for the future?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to send out the presentation that I used today, and that at the end of that presentation there are 3 links. We're still in our kind of soft launch phase. We've spoken to a lot of people about the tool. It is my hope that as we, get feedback and incorporate it into the tool, that we'll be able to embed the tool into some sort of website platform that'll make it easier to find. But for the moment, I think the best option is the presentation that I'm going to send out has 3 links at the end. And please explore. I'll add my contact information to the presentation so that you can reach out to me as well.
Thank you.
Hey, it looks like we have one question that came through in the chat from Casey. She asked, what has been the most immediate use of the data to date? How are folks already using it to orient their work and make decisions?
So that's a good question. While we presented to a lot of communities, the one that has taken up this tool most eagerly has been the Port Towns community. So far, they have not yet incorporated this into their campaign. But what we're going to be doing the next time we meet with them is, so far they've received tool demonstrations, but the next will be a workshop where people actually get to access the tool and learn how to use it on their own. What we're hoping is that we can help them to develop 1 or 2 stories using the tool that they might be able to take to either county government or legislators to argue their case for a policy change that they would like to happen. So as that occurs, we're eager to get those stories out there, but we're still in the process of getting that up and running. While we think the tool is really valuable, we also realize that it's going to take a moment for communities to learn how to use and learn how to tell their stories. And, though we've built it, we're also new to this process as well. So we're learning with the communities how to best use it as a communications device.
Great. Thanks. There are a couple more questions coming through on the chat. While those come through, does anyone have any questions on the phone? All right, so it looks like Jamie has a question. In addition to tap water data, wondering if it would be possible to include climate change impact data like extreme heat exposure, flooding, sea level, etc.
That's a great question. If data is out there, then we can certainly include it. I think that there's, as I mentioned, there's two different kind of types of data that goes into the tool. There's the kind of essential layers as well as the context layers. In making decisions about what goes into the eventual tool, that's got to be something that occurs with communities or with a particular user. Once the tool is up and running, it's not difficult to change a few of the layers, particularly the context layers. The essential layers take a little bit more time to change, but if we get feedback from a community that a particular layer is essential for their environmental justice score, and if that layer is supported by the literature, then we're eager to include it and help it and allow it to be a part of the overall score. So any data that's out there that is geographically disaggregated and supported by the literature can definitely be included. Looks like there's also a question from Evan Isaacson. Hi, Evan. It says, I apologize if this is covered already, but does watershed failure include all water pollutants or just a few? Yeah, so watershed failure is nitrogen and phosphorus. And what is this kind of status of the tool? I would say we're past beta. We're into kind of a soft launch phase. I think that we would want to go to a kind of more public launch once we've worked with the Port Towns community to tell a story with them and so that when we go into a full launch, it's not simply a tool, but it is also a demonstration of how the tool might be used by a community. One of the things we found in presenting this tool is there's a lot of enthusiasm out there, but it's not always obvious then how the tool is used from a policy or an activism standpoint. So we think that it would help with the full launch of the tool to have a community telling their story, demonstrating how the tool is used. Any more? Oh, we got one. How accurate is the score data, and will funders accept proposals based on the data for grant purposes? So that's a good question. The individual layer scores for most layers are as accurate as the data source that goes into them. So there's a lot of American Community Survey data there that is very accurate. There is EPA, kind of modeled EPA data of what level of pollutants at. So if we're looking at, for instance, the respiratory hazard index, that's data modeled by EPA tools, so we would consider this data to be very, we would consider this data to be acceptable as official, EPA data that's out there. There is a few data layers that required some additional assumptions, and these are these layers for sensitive populations. For privacy reasons, the state of Maryland only publishes this data at a zip code level. So this is, we're now looking at asthma emergency room discharges. In order to get it down to a census tract level, we followed common geographic disaggregation procedures in our geospatial platform in order to bring the level down to the census tract. So in that way, this data is going to be a little bit less accurate, but I would still consider it highly acceptable. As far as using this data for grant purposes, that's not necessarily a question that I'm qualified to answer. I've not done that yet, but I imagine that given the quality of the data that goes into it, that it would be available for such purposes. That would have to be something that is probably specific to where you're applying to and what kind of materials they accept. So that would be something that we would be interested in, certainly because we believe that continuing to build out the tool and improve it is important, and most importantly is getting it into the hands of communities that can use it to advance environmental justice concerns in their area.
All right. Looks like one more question might be coming through on the chat, but does anyone have any questions that's on the phone? All right. Mariah asks, how do you plan to, oops, something's gone away. How do you plan to share this information with EJ communities in Maryland?
That is a good question. As far as sharing with EJ communities, we plan to continue to work with the communities in Prince George's County. That's kind of where our best connections are. We also have some relationships in Baltimore, and I think we'll work those. But I would say that we don't have relationships with as many communities in the state as I think we would like to have. One of the things that would really help getting this tool in the hands of EJ communities is to have a home for the tool that's more connected to the grassroots and also more connected to community action here in Maryland. We're an academic research center, and that is community active, and we definitely believe strongly in putting research and data and knowledge in the hands of communities throughout the state. But I'm of the belief that this tool would probably have the longest legs if it's in the hands of an organization that is more in the day-to-day of grassroots organizing and policymaking here in the state of Maryland. So we're in talks with the Maryland Environmental Health Network as well as other organizations about where this tool might land. And we're certainly interested in any organization that would like to take it on. Now that the tool is developed, maintenance and presentation is certainly a smaller task than the initial development. We have another question from Casey. What is your hope for how the tool will be used to make decisions? Who do you see as your primary audience for use of the tool beyond the EJ communities themselves? How do you plan on assisting those primary target audiences in operationalizing the use of the tool? So I think I've talked a lot about how it might be used by EJ communities in Maryland, and I can certainly talk more, but I will say that when we originally developed the tool, we were very much thinking at the statewide level. As I mentioned, it came out of the Climate Commission efforts, so we were thinking a lot about how it might guide efforts in the Climate Commission to identify equity issues having to do with that. So at the statewide level, I think one of the most important things that it can do is help to establish a definition of environmental justice communities in the state. Once we have a definition, that definition can be embedded into state law or state policy, and then influence what decisions are made. So processes that might be of interest are, in particular, permitting processes about whether to allow the locating of a facility in a certain location, and giving priority to avoiding new facilities to environmental justice communities. Another idea is in investment decisions. You know, if you're investing in a park or something that might mitigate environmental justice concerns or aid an environmental justice community, perhaps they would place priority on a community that scores highly in the tool. So that's kind of a very tangible example of how the tool might be used. But we're certainly very open to additional ideas that might be out there. And I would add to that if the state or another body were to adopt this tool, we certainly recognize that their definition of environmental justice might not match up with the one that we've presented here exactly. But we do know that we have a well-supported definition embedded in the tool, and that it provides probably the strongest starting point for any final legal definition of environmental justice communities, because it is based on literature. It's based on existing tools out there. So if we try to come up with a definition, it's something to respond to and work off of to get to a final definition. So we're not just arguing over kind of the very basics about what environmental justice is.
Thanks. All right, we have a few more minutes. Any last questions? Looks like there might be one more. Oh, Mariah's saying thanks, Dan.
Thank you, everybody.
Right. Yeah, if there's no more questions, we can wrap up. I just want everyone to know that we did record today's presentation, so I'm happy to send that around to folks, especially the ones that could not join, and feel free to share that with other folks that couldn't join as well. And we want to thank Dan once again for his presentation today. Great information and great turnout as well. And if you have any other questions for Dan, is it okay if we send around your contact information?
Yeah, and I'm even going to put it in. I'm going to put it in the presentation and send you my presentation. So feel free to send
Perfect.
It all out.
Awesome. That would be great.
I guess last thing is just thank you, everybody. I really appreciate the audience and great questions. The last thing I'd say is we come at this from our own particular angle, working with particular communities in Maryland, but everyone has their own perspectives and their own concerns, and we would love to hear how other people might use this tool or think about this tool as something that can help to push sustainability and justice here in the state of Maryland.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you again, and thanks everyone that joined today. Have a great rest of your week.